Right. Deep divers, welcome back for another deep dive.
Ready to go deep.
You know it. So I just finished this book, God's Guns and Missionaries by Mano Pillai.
Oh yeah.
And I got to tell you, it really messed with my understanding of Hinduism.
Mm.
Like you think you know a thing or two about a religion,
Right.
and then bam, Pillai comes along and flips the script.
I know exactly what you mean. This book is a total mind bender.
Yeah, it really
Yeah.
digs into how European perceptions and actions, sometimes even well-intentioned ones,
Right.
played a role in shaping what we understand as Hinduism today.
Okay. So picture this, a super devout Hindu Maharaja in London for the coronation of Edward VII.
Okay.
The king falls ill, and what does this Maharaja do? He insists on visiting Buckingham Palace every single day, bringing along his cows.
What?
And not just for a stroll in Hyde Park, he's having full-on Hindu rituals performed for their well-being right there in London. That's Madho Singh for you. The Maharaja of Jaipur. It's such a wild story, but it perfectly captures this tension between holding on to your traditions while navigating a whole new world.
Yeah.
He's trying to balance his Hindu faith with his political obligations to the British, and he ends up with this fascinating, almost comical solution.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Pillai takes you on this crazy journey through centuries of history, and you start to see how European accounts of Hinduism went from these outlandish tales of monsters and human sacrifice to more nuanced but still often biased understandings.
Yeah, those early accounts are a trip, right? Like Odoric Maciusi, this Italian friar, writes about an idol in India demanding the blood of 40 virgins. It sounds like something straight out of a horror movie.
Seriously, what was in the water back then? But here's the thing. These stories, even if totally inaccurate, had a real impact. They shaped how Europeans viewed Hinduism for centuries.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a powerful example of how narratives, even false ones, can have lasting consequences. These stories solidified stereotypes and prejudices that influenced everything from missionary work to colonial policies.
Okay, speaking of missionaries, things get really interesting when Pillai dives into how some of them tried to convert Hindus by basically blending Christianity with local customs. We're talking missionaries dressing like Brahmins, even trying to incorporate Hindu deities into their teachings.
Yeah, Roberto de Nobili was a fascinating figure in all this. He genuinely believed that adapting Christianity to local traditions was the key to winning converts. But this caused a huge rift within the church. They were grappling with this tension. Do you stick rigidly to doctrine, or do you try to meet people where they are, even if it means blurring the lines a bit?
It's like that age-old dilemma, right? Do you change yourself to fit the world, or do you try to change the world to fit you? And it wasn't just a religious debate. This played out against the backdrop of the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment back in Europe. The whole world was going through a religious and philosophical upheaval.
Exactly. It's all connected. What's happening in Europe is influencing how they view and interact with Hinduism in India, and vice versa. What Europeans are learning about Hinduism is feeding back into their own debates about faith and reason.
It's crazy how one book can make you realize how interconnected everything really is.
Right. But it doesn't stop there. This is where things get really academic. Pillai digs into the rise of Orientalism, which is this whole movement of European scholars trying to study and categorize Eastern cultures, including Hinduism. We're talking big names like William Jones and James Mill.
So we're moving from wild tales of monsters to guys in dusty libraries poring over ancient texts.
Pretty much. These guys were brilliant, and they made some huge contributions to our understanding of languages, history, and philosophy. But they also came with their own biases and agendas. They were often looking for this pure and authentic Hinduism, which they believed was embodied in the Vedas, and they kind of overlooked the lived experiences and diverse practices of actual Hindus across India.
It's like they were trying to create a perfect, idealized version of Hinduism that fit their own Western framework, even if it didn't really reflect the messy, vibrant reality on the ground. And here's the kicker. This academic focus on the Vedas, combined with British colonial policies, actually played a role in solidifying a more unified Hindu identity.
And that's the real paradox, isn't it? The British, with their obsession with categorizing everything unintentionally, helped create a stronger sense of Hindu-ness.
Hold on, I gotta hear more about that. How did that even happen?
Well, one key factor was the introduction of censuses. The British wanted to count and classify the population, and religion became a major category.
So suddenly everyone had to pick a team, Hindu, Muslim, or other.
In essence, yes.
Right.
And while this might seem like a mundane administrative detail, it had a huge impact on how people saw themselves. Before, Hindus primarily identified through caste, region, language, or specific deity worship. But now they were being lumped together under this broad category of Hindu, regardless of their differences.
It's almost like the Brits inadvertently created a Hindu box and everyone was suddenly expected to fit in it.
Exactly. And this had some unforeseen consequences. For one, it made Hindus aware of their numerical majority in India, something they hadn't really focused on before. And that realization fueled the nationalist movement. It gave them a sense of shared identity and a platform to demand greater political representation.
It's mind-blowing how something as seemingly neutral as a census could have such a profound ripple effect on a whole society. But let's not forget about the missionaries who are still hard at work trying to win converts.
Right, and this is where things get even more interesting because Hindus weren't just passively resisting conversion, they were actively engaging in theological debates and challenging Christian beliefs.
Wait, so we're talking full-on religious smackdowns,
Hmm.
Hindus versus missionaries.
Absolutely. And these weren't just intellectual exercises either. They had real-world consequences. For example, Pillai talks about how some Hindus point out the hypocrisy of Christians condemning idol worship while venerating images of the Virgin Mary.
Ouch. That's got to sting. Calling out hypocrisy is a power move. It exposes the double standards and cultural biases embedded in religious critiques.
It was a very effective tactic, and it forced missionaries to rethink their strategies. They realized that simply dismissing Hinduism as paganism wasn't going to cut it. They needed to find more persuasive arguments and approaches.
So what did they do? Did they start handing out pamphlets with bullet points comparing and contrasting religions?
Some of them actually got a lot more sophisticated in their approach. For instance, the German missionaries in Tranquebar shifted their focus to education and social services as a way to gain influence.
Interesting. So instead of just preaching at people, they started building schools and hospitals.
Exactly. It was a more subtle form of conversion, but arguably more effective in the long run. Mission schools became incredibly popular, and they played a significant role in introducing Western education to India.
Wow. Talk about unintended consequences.
Huh.
So they might not have been winning converts en masse, but they were still shaping Indian society in a big way.
It's a classic example of how cultural exchange is rarely a simple one-way street. It's messy, unpredictable, and often leads to unexpected outcomes.
All right, let's shift gears for a second and dive into this whole Orientalism thing. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how European scholars studying Hinduism actually ended up shaping the religion itself.
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox. On the one hand, you have these brilliant scholars like William Jones, who was a judge in Calcutta, absolutely fascinated by Sanskrit and ancient Indian literature. He saw Hinduism as a complex philosophical system worthy of serious study, which was a huge shift from those earlier monster-filled accounts.
So they're basically treating Hinduism with a newfound respect, like an intellectual equal.
Yes, in a way. And they made some groundbreaking discoveries. Jones, for instance, is credited with establishing the connection between Sanskrit and European languages, which revolutionized the study of linguistics.
That's massive. They're not just studying Hinduism, they're making significant contributions to our understanding of language and history as a whole.
Exactly. And this newfound appreciation for Hindu intellectual traditions had a ripple effect back in India. It gave reformers like Ram Mohan Roy more ammunition to argue that Hinduism was a rational, enlightened faith capable of holding its own against Western thought.
So in a way, the Orientalists inadvertently provided the intellectual tools for Hindu reformers to modernize and defend their own religion.
You could definitely say that it's this fascinating dance between opposing forces where colonialism and scholarship, despite their often negative aspects, ended up sparking a kind of intellectual renaissance within Hinduism.
Okay, but let's be real. These Orientalists weren't exactly free of bias,
Yeah,
right? They still came with their own baggage and preconceived notions about the East.
that's true. They often approached Hinduism with a sense of Western superiority, believing that they were uncovering a lost or primitive civilization. And they tended to fixate on ancient texts like the Vedas, which they saw as the purest form of Hinduism, while neglecting the diverse practices and beliefs of everyday Hindus.
So they were essentially creating their own version of Hinduism, one that fit their scholarly framework, even if it didn't fully capture the lived realities of millions of people.
Precisely. And this selective focus had a lasting impact on how Hinduism was perceived both in the West and even within India itself. It created this idea of an ideal Hinduism based on ancient texts, which sometimes clashed with the actual lived experiences of Hindus.
This is getting super interesting, but we're about out of time for this part of the deep dive.
Indeed, we are.
I guess we'll have to pick this back up next time. But one burning question I have is, how did Hindus react to all this?
Yeah.
I mean, they're being studied, categorized, and even critiqued by outsiders. Did they just sit back and take it?
That's a great question, and one we'll definitely unpack in part 2 of our deep dive into God's guns and missionaries.
Until then, stay curious, deep divers.
Welcome back to our deep dive into God's guns and missionaries.
We're picking up right where we left off, exploring how Hindus responded to all these outside forces swirling around their faith.
It's a fascinating story of resilience, adaptation, and even a bit of clever pushback.
Okay, so remind me, where did we leave off?
We were talking about how European scholars, the so-called Orientalists, were busy studying ancient Hindu texts, often with this idea of finding the true or pure form of the religion.
Right, like they were on a quest for the ultimate Hindu cheat code.
Exactly. And meanwhile, British colonialism, with its love for categories and censuses, was unintentionally creating a more unified Hindu identity.
So you've got these two powerful forces shaping how Hindus were perceived, both from within and from the outside.
Precisely. And the big question is, how did Hindus themselves react to all of this? Did they just passively absorb these influences?
That's what I'm dying to know. Give me the inside scoop.
Well, the answer is far from simple. Hindus responded in a variety of ways, some subtle, some more confrontational, but always with this underlying sense of preserving their traditions while adapting to the changing landscape.
Okay, so what did this act of resistance look like? Did they form secret societies, write angry letters to the editor, boycott British tea?
All great guesses, but the reality was often more nuanced. Pillai highlights this fascinating text called The Vindication, written by a group of Brahmins in direct response to missionary critiques of Hinduism.
Vindication. Sounds like they were ready to drop some serious knowledge bombs.
Essentially, they argued that Europeans were judging Hinduism based on their own limited understanding and cultural biases. They pointed out that Hinduism was incredibly diverse with a deep intellectual history, and it couldn't be reduced to these simplistic, often negative stereotypes.
It's like they were saying, hey, you haven't even scratched the surface of what Hinduism is really about. Get your facts straight before you come at us with your judgments.
Exactly. They weren't just defending their beliefs, they were challenging the very framework through which Europeans were trying to understand them.
That's such a powerful act of intellectual resistance, reclaiming the narrative, so to speak.
And this wasn't just happening among the elite either. Everyday Hindus found their own ways to navigate these pressures.
Give me an example. What were ordinary folks doing to hold on to their faith?
Well, one tactic was simply to maintain their traditional practices, even if it meant doing so discreetly.
So, like hiding their idols under the floorboards and whispering their mantras when no one was looking.
You got it. It was a way of preserving their cultural identity, even under pressure, to conform to a new way of life.
It's almost like a spiritual form of guerrilla warfare, resisting assimilation through quiet acts of defiance.
I love that analogy. And sometimes this resistance took even more unexpected forms. Pillai talks about how in some parts of India, Hindus actually started incorporating aspects of Christianity into their own belief systems.
Wait, what? Blending Hinduism and Christianity? How did that even work?
It sounds strange, right? But it speaks to this incredible adaptability that's always been a hallmark of Hinduism. For instance, in some communities, Christian saints began to be venerated alongside Hindu deities.
So like adding Jesus to the pantheon right alongside Ganesh and Shiva?
Well, not exactly. It's more about recognizing shared values or finding parallels between different religious figures. It's a way of acknowledging the presence of a new faith while still holding on to their own traditions.
It's like they were taking what they found useful or resonant in Christianity and weaving it into the fabric of their own belief system.
Precisely. And this kind of religious fusion, sometimes called syncretism, is something you see throughout history. It's a testament to the human capacity to find meaning and connection across different traditions.
It makes you realize that religions aren't these static, isolated things. They evolve, they adapt, they borrow from each other. It's messy and fluid.
Absolutely. And this fluidity was essential for Hinduism to survive and thrive amidst all the challenges it faced during this period.
Okay, so we've got Hindus writing treatises, secretly worshiping their deities, even blending beliefs with Christianity. It's a wild mix of responses. But what about the big picture impact? Did all of this fundamentally change Hinduism as we know it today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Pillai argues that, yes, these encounters with European ideas and colonialism did leave a lasting mark on Hinduism.
So we basically ended up with Hinduism 2.0, a new and improved version.
Well, it's not quite that simple. It's more about a shift in emphasis and a renewed focus on certain aspects of Hindu tradition.
Walk me through it. What were some of the key changes that emerged?
For starters, there was a renewed interest in ancient texts like the Vedas and Upanishads. These texts had always been important, but they gained even greater prominence during this period.
Why is that? Were Hindus suddenly feeling nostalgic for the good old days?
Not quite. It was more about finding intellectual ammunition to counter European critiques. Remember, Orientalists were fixated on these texts, claiming they represented the purest form of Hinduism. So Hindu reformers began emphasizing these texts as well, using them to argue that their faith was just as sophisticated and philosophically sound as any Western religion.
It's like they were saying, hey, we've got ancient wisdom too, don't underestimate us.
Exactly. And this emphasis on the Vedas also helped fuel a wave of reform movements within Hinduism.
Like the guys we talked about earlier, Ramamohan Roy and Dayananda Sarasvati.
Yes. These reformers drew inspiration from the Vedas to advocate for a more monotheistic interpretation of Hinduism, one that emphasized reason and ethical conduct.
So they were trying to create a version of Hinduism that could stand up to the intellectual scrutiny of the West while still staying true to their core beliefs.
Precisely. But it's important to remember that this wasn't just about blindly adopting European ideas.
Right. It wasn't a case of West is best, let's ditch all our traditions.
Exactly. It was about selectively choosing what resonated with them, reinterpreting those ideas through their own cultural lens, and ultimately forging a new understanding of Hinduism that was both modern and rooted in tradition.
It's like they were remixing Hinduism, taking the best of both worlds, and creating something fresh and relevant for their time.
That's a great way to put it. And this process of adaptation and reinterpretation didn't end with colonialism.
So Hinduism is still evolving even today.
Absolutely. It's a living tradition constantly responding to new challenges and opportunities. The Hinduism you see today is a product of centuries of interaction, adaptation, and reinvention.
It makes you realize that religions aren't static museums. They're living organisms constantly changing and growing.
Precisely. And that's what makes studying them so fascinating. It's a window into the human search for meaning and belonging in an ever-changing world.
All right, so Hindus were pushing back against European perceptions, blending beliefs, adapting and evolving. It's a remarkable story of resilience. But what about the impact of all this on specific aspects of Hindu practice? Did any rituals or traditions change as a result of these encounters?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll delve into as we continue our exploration of gods, guns, and missionaries.
Stay tuned, deep divers, because we're about to uncover even more fascinating insights. Welcome back, deep divers.
Ready for the final plunge.
You know it. So last time, we're talking about how Hindus responded to European influences and colonialism. And it's clear they weren't just sitting around twiddling their thumbs.
Absolutely not. They were actively engaging, debating, resisting, and even adapting in ways that shaped the Hinduism we see today.
Right. It's like they were playing this high-stakes game of religious chess, trying to anticipate the next move and come up with a counter strategy.
That's a great analogy. And one of the key pieces on the board was the way Hindus approached ritual and tradition. Remember, Europeans often criticized what they saw as idolatry or superstition in Hinduism.
Yeah, those early accounts are full of descriptions of bizarre rituals and strange gods.
Exactly. And those perceptions fueled missionary efforts to convert Hindus to Christianity, which they saw as a more rational and civilized religion.
So how did Hindus respond to these attacks on their traditions? Did they double down, abandon them altogether, or find some middle ground?
Well, it was a mix of all of the above, depending on the community and the specific practice.
Give me an example. What kind of changes did we see in Hindu rituals?
One interesting case is the practice of sati, which involved a widow immolating herself on her husband's funeral pyre.
Yeah, that's one of the most controversial aspects of Hinduism, often cited as evidence of its barbarity.
Right, and it became a major target for both missionaries and British colonial authorities who saw it as a horrific and oppressive custom.
So did they manage to stamp it out completely?
Well, it's a complex story. While sati was never widespread across India, it was practiced in certain regions and communities.
So it wasn't like every widow was expected to jump on the fire.
No, not at all. It was often associated with specific social classes or even seen as a way for a woman to gain spiritual liberation.
Interesting. So how did things change with the arrival of Europeans?
Well, British officials, influenced by both humanitarian concerns and a desire to assert control, began to outlaw sati in the early 19th century.
So they basically came in and said, nope, no more burning widows. We're calling the shots now.
Essentially, yes. And this sparked a huge debate within Hindu society.
I bet. It's not every day the government tells you how to practice your religion.
Exactly. Some Hindus defended sati as an ancient and sacred tradition, arguing that the British had no right to interfere.
It's like that whole freedom of religion argument, right?
Exactly. But others, like Ramamohan Roy, who we talked about earlier, actually supported the ban. They argued that sati was a distortion of true Hindu teachings and that it went against the principles of compassion and nonviolence.
So you had Hindus on both sides of the issue debating the meaning of their own traditions.
Absolutely. And this debate ultimately led to a decline in the practice of sati, although it didn't disappear overnight.
It's fascinating how even something as deeply rooted as a religious ritual can be subject to change and reinterpretation.
Right. And this pattern of adaptation and change wasn't limited to sati. We see it in other aspects of Hindu practice as well.
Give me another example. What else was evolving?
Well, another interesting area is temple worship.
Okay, so we're talking about the physical spaces where Hindus connect with their gods.
Exactly. And during the colonial period, we see some shifts in how temples were managed and how rituals were performed.
So, like, were they adding stained glass windows and pews?
Not quite, but there were changes. For instance, under British rule, many temples came under the control of the government or wealthy patrons.
So it's like the state was getting involved in religious affairs.
In a way, yes. And this sometimes led to tensions between traditional priests and the new administrators.
I can imagine that didn't go over too well. Priests probably weren't thrilled about sharing power.
Definitely not. But there were also some positive changes that came out of this shift.
Like what? Did they start offering better snacks at temple festivals?
Maybe. But more importantly, we see a growing emphasis on temple hygiene and sanitation.
Okay, that's actually pretty important. Temples can get crowded, so keeping things clean is key.
Absolutely. And reformers like Dayananda Sarasvati, who we discussed earlier, pushed for these reforms. They argued that cleanliness was essential for spiritual purity and that temples should be models of order and discipline.
So they were trying to modernize temple practices, make them more in line with modern ideas about hygiene.
Precisely. And this focus on cleanliness continues to be an important part of Hindu temple culture today.
It's fascinating how these seemingly small changes can reflect larger shifts in society and values.
Right. It shows how religion isn't just about abstract beliefs. It's also about how we live our lives, how we interact with our communities, and how we create a sense of order in the world.
Okay, so we've seen how Hindus responded to European challenges by rethinking rituals, reforming practices, and even blending beliefs.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to explore: the role of nationalism in shaping modern Hinduism.
Ah, yes. The quest for independence from British rule. How did that impact the way Hindus saw themselves and their faith?
Well, it's a complex and often contentious issue, but there's no denying that nationalism played a huge role in shaping 20th century Hinduism.
So the fight for freedom became intertwined with the fight for religious identity.
Exactly. And this is where figures like Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, who we touched on earlier, become really important.
Remind me, what was Savarkar all about?
He was a fierce advocate for Hindu nationalism. He believed that Hinduism wasn't just a religion, but a cultural and national identity that encompassed all those who considered India their homeland.
So more like a civilization than just a set of beliefs.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. And this idea, which he called Hindutva, became incredibly powerful in the movement for independence.
So the fight for a free India became inseparable from the idea of a Hindu India.
In many ways, yes. And this had a profound impact on the way Hinduism was perceived and practiced. For some, it was a unifying force bringing Hindus together under a shared sense of purpose.
It's like that rallying cry where Hindus were proud and were taking back our country.
Exactly. But for others, this blending of religion and nationalism was problematic. It raised concerns about the place of minorities in a Hindu-majority nation.
It's that age-old dilemma, right? How do you balance the rights of the individual with the needs of the nation, especially when those needs are defined in religious terms?
Precisely. And these tensions continue to play out in Indian politics and society today.
It's a reminder that the story of Hinduism is far from over. It's an ongoing journey, constantly being shaped by new challenges and opportunities.
Absolutely. And God's Guns and Missionaries gives us this incredible glimpse into this evolution, revealing the complex interplay of forces that have shaped one of the world's oldest and most diverse religions.
Well, folks, that concludes our deep dive into God's Guns and Missionaries. It's been a wild ride, full of surprising twists, fascinating insights, and a whole lot of food for thought.
Hopefully you've come away with a deeper appreciation for the complexity and dynamism of Hinduism.
And if you're like me, you're probably itching to learn even more. So pick up a copy of the book, do your own deep dive, and let us know what you discover in the comments.
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
As always, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.